Hello, esteemed gentlemen. The moment someone stops reacting the way you expect, the illusion of control begins to crack. Most people believe power is loud. They think control looks like commands, reactions, raised voices, emotional leverage, or dominance games. But psychology tells a different story. Studies on influence and authority consistently show that the hardest individuals to control are not the most aggressive ones. They're the ones who remain internally directed, meaning their decisions are guided by values rather than pressure. And that's exactly where the Sigma male quietly breaks the system. When people try to remote a Sigma male, they assume he's just another personality that can be managed with the usual buttons: approval, guilt, fear, urgency, or social pressure. What they don't expect is the strange emotional glitch that follows. There's no fight, no dramatic resistance, no speech, just a subtle shift where things stop working the way they used to. Messages land, but don't move him. Pressure applies, but nothing bends. It's like trying to control a device that runs on an operating system no one else has access to. That's when confusion sets in, then irritation, then something more uncomfortable: self-awareness. Because when control fails without confrontation, it forces people to question whether they ever had authority at all. And that realization doesn't feel empowering. It feels destabilizing. A little embarrassing, actually. Like waving a remote at a TV that clearly isn't yours, while everyone in the room pretends not to notice. This isn't about ego. It isn't about rebellion. It's about what happens psychologically when someone refuses to be emotionally programmable. The reactions people have in that moment are rarely logical. They're revealing. And once you see them clearly, you can't unsee them. Number 1. They experience a sudden loss of relevance. When people try to remote a Sigma male, what hits them first isn't resistance or conflict. It's something far more unsettling. They stop mattering the way they used to. Calls still go through, conversations still happen, but the emotional weight is gone. Their opinions don't land with the same force. Their approval doesn't speed things up. Their disapproval doesn't slow anything down. And that's when discomfort creeps in. Most social power is built on relevance. People feel important when their reactions influence behavior. When someone explains themselves to you, reacts emotionally to you, adjusts their choices because of you, it creates a quiet sense of authority. The Sigma male removes that without announcement. He doesn't argue. He doesn't withdraw dramatically. He simply stops orienting his decisions around external validation. That subtle shift strips people of a role they didn't realize they were clinging to. What makes this reaction surprising is how personal it feels. People start asking themselves why their presence suddenly feels optional. The Sigma male hasn't insulted them. He hasn't cut them off. He hasn't declared independence. He's just no longer referencing them internally. And that absence hits harder than rejection. Rejection still acknowledges importance. Irrelevance doesn't. This is where frustration shows up. People repeat themselves more. They explain harder. They increase emotional tone, urgency, or authority, not because they want control for its own sake, but because they're trying to restore the feeling of being central. The Sigma male interprets none of this as power. To him, it's noise. His focus has already moved inward toward his own standards, priorities, and internal compass. The uncomfortable truth is that many relationships quietly rely on influence rather than respect. When that influence disappears, the connection feels unstable. The Sigma male doesn't expose this on purpose, but his detachment reveals it anyway. People aren't reacting to his silence or distance. They're reacting to the realization that they were never essential to his sense of direction. And that realization lingers, because once someone understands that their presence is optional, not required, the dynamic can never fully return to what it was. Number 2. They feel oddly exposed around him. When people try to remote a Sigma male, something uncomfortable starts happening inside them. They begin to feel exposed, even though he hasn't accused them of anything, questioned their motives, or pushed back openly. It's a quiet unease, like standing in a room that's too well lit. Nothing is being said, yet everything feels visible. This happens because the Sigma male doesn't play the usual emotional games. He doesn't rush to explain himself, doesn't overreact, and doesn't fill silence with nervous talking. That lack of performance removes the social cover most people rely on. Without emotional back and forth, there's nowhere to hide intentions. The person trying to control him becomes painfully aware of what they're doing and why they're doing it. Most people are comfortable when emotions are exchanged rapidly. Reactions create noise, and noise creates distraction. The Sigma male's calm strips that away. His presence slows the interaction down, and in that slowness, motives become obvious. Control attempts feel louder. Manipulation feels clumsier. Even harmless suggestions start sounding strategic in the speaker's own head. What makes this exposure unsettling is that it isn't forced. The Sigma male doesn't corner anyone. He doesn't interrogate or pressure. He simply refuses to mirror anxiety, urgency, or emotional drama. That neutrality acts like a mirror people didn't ask for. They hear themselves more clearly. They notice the need for influence, validation, or dominance they usually disguise as concern or leadership. As this discomfort grows, people often project. They label him distant, cold, or intimidating, not because he is, but because being around him removes their emotional camouflage. His steadiness makes their internal tension stand out. The harder they try to regain control, the more aware they become of their own imbalance. This exposure also triggers defensiveness. People start justifying themselves out loud, explaining motives that were never questioned. They feel the urge to clarify, soften, or dominate the interaction, even though the Sigma male hasn't demanded any of it. His silence isn't pressure, but it feels like pressure to those who rely on emotional leverage to feel secure. In the end, what people react to isn't the Sigma male's behavior. It's the way his self-contained nature highlights their own need to manage outcomes. Around him, control attempts feel naked, and that quiet exposure is deeply uncomfortable for anyone who isn't used to being alone with their intentions. Number 3, they mistake his non-compliance for arrogance. When someone tries to remote a Sigma male, the first reaction is almost always misinterpretation. They see his refusal to bend, his calm disregard for expectations, and his quiet adherence to his own code, and they label it arrogance. They assume that because he isn't performing the usual rituals of approval or obedience, he must think he's superior. What they fail to realize is that his behavior isn't about ego at all. It's about internal alignment. The Sigma male doesn't engage in unnecessary explanations or justification because he doesn't feel compelled to. His silence isn't a statement of pride, it's a statement of autonomy. He doesn't measure himself against their standards, so there's no battle of superiority. What feels like arrogance to outsiders is actually indifference to irrelevant authority, a quality most people have never truly encountered. This misunderstanding triggers a cascade of emotions in those trying to control him. They feel challenged without being challenged. Their assumptions about hierarchy, influence, and dominance start to crumble. Every tactic they try, pressure, guilt, urgency, persuasion, fails, and the failure isn't dramatic. There's no fight to win, no reaction to exploit. This absence of response feels disrespectful to them, and they interpret it as haughtiness rather than what it really is, self-governance. The danger of this misreading is that it leads to escalation. People often respond to perceived arrogance with annoyance, confrontation, or attempts to reassert control. The Sigma male, however, doesn't engage on that level. His focus remains on his own priorities, which makes outsiders' reactions look petty, desperate, or irrational. That contrast is what unnerves them. Ultimately, what they call arrogance is a mirror reflecting their own need for influence. They expect compliance because it validates their sense of authority. When the Sigma male doesn't comply, it forces them to confront the uncomfortable truth. Their perception of power is conditional, fragile, and externally anchored. The Sigma's refusal doesn't inflate him, it exposes them. And that exposure, misunderstood as arrogance, is the quiet, invisible leverage he wields without lifting a finger. Number 4. They feel an urge to escalate control unnecessarily. When people realize their usual tactics aren't working on a Sigma male, something inside them shifts almost instinctively. Light pressure, polite suggestions, emotional nudges, everything that normally gets results suddenly feels weak, ineffective, and humiliating. That's when the urge to escalate kicks in. They add more rules, impose tighter deadlines, speak louder, repeat themselves endlessly, or try to force emotional responses. It's a natural reflex. When influence fails, most people double down without stopping to consider why it failed in the first place. What they don't understand is that escalation doesn't create compliance. It confirms detachment. The Sigma male doesn't perceive the pressure as a challenge to overcome. He simply notes the change in the environment and adjusts accordingly. He isn't reacting emotionally. He isn't strategizing against them. He is recalibrating his attention toward what actually matters. Every extra push, every raised voice, every attempt to assert dominance becomes meaningless noise in his internal world. And because they can't see that, their frustration grows. This escalating pattern is exhausting for outsiders. They feel trapped in a feedback loop where more effort seems necessary, yet produces less effect. It's a deeply uncomfortable feeling because control, for most people, is tied to self-esteem. Failing to achieve it makes them question their competence, their judgment, and even their relevance. Meanwhile, the Sigma male remains calm, unaffected, and unobligated by their attempts. Ironically, the more they push, the more the Sigma's detachment becomes absolute. Their escalation serves only to highlight the futility of trying to manipulate him, and it exposes how much their sense of authority depends on external validation. The Sigma doesn't need to resist actively. His autonomy is already non-negotiable. Their obsession with creating a reaction is visible, desperate, and ultimately irrelevant. By the time they notice the futility, it's too late. They've revealed their own dependency on control and their inability to influence someone whose alignment is internal. The Sigma male doesn't just withstand pressure. He makes it useless, turning attempts at control into a mirror that reflects their insecurity. And that realization is both humbling and infuriating, which is exactly why trying to escalate never works. Number 5. They realize too late that they were depending on him. One of the most surprising reactions people get when they try to remote a Sigma male is the sudden, uncomfortable awareness of how much they relied on him without even noticing it. It isn't obvious at first. The Sigma doesn't announce his contributions, doesn't demand credit, and doesn't draw attention to the ways he keeps systems, relationships, or environments stable. He simply operates quietly, efficiently, and according to his own standards. People assume he's just another figure in the background, interchangeable and replaceable. That assumption is the trap. When attempts to control him fail and he withdraws, the void becomes apparent. The projects that ran smoothly begin to wobble. Conversations that once had subtle direction become muddled. Decisions that were quietly influenced by his insight no longer land. The absence isn't dramatic, but it's palpable. It forces people to see the Sigma not as someone they could manage or mold, but as someone whose presence had been silently integral. And that realization hits harder than any confrontation or argument could. What makes it even more striking is that it comes too late to regain leverage. By the time people notice their dependency, they are already reacting from a place of desperation. They realize they were relying on his stability, his judgment, and his internal compass to make their own lives feel ordered. And now all of that is gone. There's no shouting, no punishment, no revenge, just a quiet removal of influence. That stillness feels heavier than conflict because it forces them to confront their own lack of self-sufficiency. The Sigma male doesn't create dependency intentionally. He doesn't manipulate people into relying on him. He simply moves through the world aligned with his own principles, solving problems and maintaining his own direction. The shock for others is realizing that they had built their expectations around him, not the other way around. They mistook his cooperation for obligation, his calm efficiency for compliance, and his silent guidance for servitude. When that dependence finally comes to light, it's a jarring revelation. People see that what they thought was control was actually a subtle partnership they never earned. By the time they understand, the Sigma male has already moved beyond needing them, and the clarity of that absence is both humbling and unforgettable. Number 6. Their authority feels questioned without being challenged. One of the strangest and most unsettling reactions people experience when trying to remote a Sigma male is the creeping sense that their authority is being undermined, even though he hasn't said a word. There's no argument, no direct defiance, no public confrontation, nothing that would traditionally indicate a challenge. Yet something in his calm independence makes people question themselves, their influence, and the weight of their own commands. It's a subtle, almost invisible shift, but it hits hard. Most people assume power exists in overt displays, assertive speech, visible control, reactions that bend others to their will. The Sigma male doesn't operate that way. He follows his own rules, measures outcomes against his own standards, and filters engagement based on relevance, not obligation. He doesn't compete for approval, so by simply existing outside the expected hierarchy, he exposes the fragility of anyone who relies on that hierarchy for validation. Their authority starts to feel performative because, without their influence affecting him, they realize it has no inherent power. This realization is deeply uncomfortable. People try harder to assert themselves, repeating instructions, emphasizing rules, or applying emotional pressure. The more they push, the more they notice his detachment. He doesn't react, but his neutrality speaks volumes. In the absence of compliance, the illusion of control dissolves. They begin questioning whether their position is earned, deserved, or even meaningful. That inner doubt is far more destabilizing than any confrontation because it's internal, silent, and persistent. What's terrifying for most is that this effect doesn't require effort from the Sigma male. He doesn't need to fight or resist. His authority is self-contained, and by refusing to center anyone else's expectations, he quietly dismantles the need for external validation. The Sigma's independence highlights how much of other people's perceived control is dependent on the willingness of others to accept it. By the time this awareness settles in, people feel disoriented. Authority feels tenuous, rules feel arbitrary, and influence feels conditional. The Sigma male doesn't challenge them, yet in doing nothing he forces them to confront the hollow foundations of the control they assumed they had. And that revelation is far more unsettling than any overt rebellion could ever be. Number 7. They become obsessed with figuring him out. When people try to remote a Sigma male and fail, something almost compulsive begins to take hold. They start thinking about him more than they realize, analyzing every word, every gesture, every pause. It's subtle at first, an attempt to understand why their usual influence tactics aren't working. But quickly, it grows into an obsession, a mental loop they can't break. They aren't just curious, They are desperate for predictability, and the Sigma male refuses to provide it. The reason this happens is simple. The Sigma male doesn't fit into the expected social templates. He doesn't react according to hierarchy, emotion, or external pressure. He operates according to his own internal code, which is invisible to outsiders. That lack of predictability is infuriating and fascinating at the same time. People are wired to seek patterns, and when familiar patterns fail, the mind intensifies its search. They analyze every interaction, trying to find leverage, trying to decode the system that governs him, but there is no system to hack. What makes the obsession so destabilizing is that it begins to dominate thinking. People replay conversations in their heads, scrutinize his past actions, and imagine possible reactions. They convince themselves that if they just understood him fully, they could regain control. But the Sigma male isn't a puzzle meant to be solved. He isn't performing or hiding. He simply refuses to operate according to anyone else's assumptions. The harder they try to dissect him, the less accessible he becomes, and the more intense their fixation grows. This mental loop is exhausting and revealing. It exposes how much they depend on predictability to feel safe, powerful, and in control. The Sigma male's indifference to these attempts isn't arrogance, it's autonomy. Yet that autonomy acts like a magnet for obsession because it forces people to confront the uncomfortable truth. No one can be owned, controlled, or fully understood on someone else's terms. By the time they recognize their fixation, it's too late. They have already invested their energy, attention, and mental space trying to decode a person who can't be decoded. The Sigma male remains calm, unaffected, and internally guided, while their obsession quietly exposes their need for control, predictability, and validation, and the futility of trying to impose it on someone who simply doesn't comply. Number 8, they accuse him of being emotionally unavailable. When people try to remote a Sigma male, one of the first complaints that comes up is that he's emotionally unavailable. They look at his calm demeanor, his refusal to over-explain, and his selective engagement, and they assume he's withholding, distant, or cold. What they fail to see is that emotional availability isn't a switch the Sigma flips for everyone. It's a resource he allocates intentionally, based on respect, alignment, and relevance. His unavailability isn't denial, it's discretion. Most people confuse predictability with access. They are used to relationships where compliance and reaction create a sense of emotional connection. If someone responds as expected, they interpret it as availability, attachment, or investment. The Sigma male doesn't operate on those terms. He invests emotion where it matters, to people and situations that meet his standards. To those trying to control him, his restraint feels like rejection, but in reality, it's a measure of his independence. This perception triggers frustration. People try harder, expecting to earn the access they think is owed. They escalate emotional appeals, drop hints, or demand explanations. They interpret calm detachment as punishment or manipulation. They fail to recognize that the Sigma male's behavior exposes a harsh truth. Emotional energy is not a currency to be claimed. It's a choice to be earned. The irony is that those who complain about his unavailability are often the ones attempting to engineer their own emotional comfort through control. They project their expectation of access onto him, and when it isn't met, they misread neutrality as coldness. The Sigma male's emotional economy is self-contained. It doesn't revolve around validating anyone else's feelings, and that independence unsettles people who depend on emotional influence to feel secure. By accusing him of being unavailable, they reveal their own entitlement. They are not responding to a lack of emotion. They are responding to the refusal to perform emotional labor on demand. His calm detachment shines a light on the transactional nature of their assumptions. And the uncomfortable realization is this: The Sigma male isn't emotionally unavailable. He's simply unreachable to anyone who hasn't earned the right to touch his world. That distinction is subtle, but it's devastatingly clear once you notice it. Number 9. They realize compliance was never part of his identity. When people try to remote a Sigma male, they often expect some form of resistance or negotiation, a pushback they can anticipate and manage. What they get instead is silence, calm, and the unmistakable sense that compliance isn't even in his vocabulary. That realization is disorienting because it challenges one of the most fundamental assumptions most people carry, that everyone can be guided, influenced, or directed if you apply enough pressure. With the Sigma male, that assumption collapses entirely. Compliance, for him, has never been a strategy or a choice. It's simply irrelevant. He doesn't follow rules because they exist, and he doesn't seek approval because it's offered. His actions are governed by an internal code that no external authority can override. That detachment makes others feel powerless, but it isn't powerlessness for him. It's clarity. People around him start to notice that no matter what ultimatum, persuasion, or emotional leverage they employ, it never results in the predictable submission they expect. That absence of predictable reaction is like a glitch in the system of control they've always relied on. The more they push, the more glaring the truth becomes. They were never in control. Every attempt to influence him only highlights their own dependency on external validation. They start replaying interactions in their head, trying to pinpoint the moment they could have broken through. But there isn't a breakthrough to be found. The Sigma male isn't hiding a weak spot or planning resistance. He simply doesn't operate in the framework that requires compliance at all. This realization is quietly humiliating. It exposes how much of human interaction depends on agreed-upon roles, expectations, and obedience. The Sigma male refuses to participate in those scripts, and in doing so, he forces people to confront their own assumptions about influence and authority. They begin to understand that what they thought was leverage was never real leverage, and the Sigma's autonomy wasn't earned, challenged, or resisted. It simply existed. By the time this dawns on them, the truth is unavoidable. Compliance was never an option, and their attempts to enforce it only revealed how reliant they were on controlling outcomes. The Sigma male's identity is self-contained, and that fact is both infuriating and quietly revolutionary for anyone who encounters it. Number 10. They feel replaced by his internal compass. When people try to remote a Sigma male, the most disorienting moment isn't his silence, his calm, or his refusal to comply. It's the subtle, almost invisible awareness that he doesn't rely on them or anyone else for direction. Every decision he makes, every action he takes, is guided by his own internal compass, and that realization hits harder than confrontation ever could. It's not that he's ignoring them, it's that their influence was never part of his calculations. That understanding leaves people feeling oddly redundant, replaced by something invisible yet far more compelling: his own sense of purpose. Most people unconsciously measure their relevance by the extent to which others depend on them. Control, attention, and approval become ways to feel essential. When a Sigma male operates independently, he quietly exposes this dependence. They start noticing that suggestions, commands, or emotional appeals no longer carry weight. Their role in his world is optional, and that optionality is a mirror reflecting how much of their perceived authority was never real. It was borrowed from his willingness to consider them. This realization triggers subtle panic. People try harder, push more, or become obsessively present, as if they can reinsert themselves into his internal decision-making process. But the Sigma male doesn't bend. He isn't calculating a reaction, and he isn't playing a social game. He moves according to what aligns with his values and priorities. The harder they try to assert influence, the more obvious their redundancy becomes. Feeling replaced by someone's internal compass is unsettling because it exposes the illusion of control. They believed their presence, guidance, or authority mattered, only to realize the Sigma male's internal guidance has always been sufficient. They are confronted not with rebellion, resistance, or anger, but with the quiet fact that he never needed their input in the first place. That revelation is both humbling and infuriating. It's humbling because it highlights the limits of influence and the futility of trying to control someone fundamentally self-directed. It's infuriating because it exposes dependency they weren't ready to admit. In the end, the Sigma male's internal compass doesn't just guide him, it silently replaces the need for anyone else to steer his path, leaving observers to wrestle with their own irrelevance. Number 11. They are forced to confront their need for control. When people try to remote a Sigma male, the most uncomfortable reaction isn't anger, confusion, or frustration. It's the mirror he holds up to their own need for control. They start by trying the usual methods: persuasion, pressure, emotional leverage, subtle manipulation. At first it seems normal. He's polite, he responds, he engages. But slowly, the realization creeps in that none of it is working the way it should. Nothing bends him, nothing triggers the expected reaction, and that's when the discomfort turns inward. Most people don't like to admit how much of their sense of power depends on influencing others. Control feels like security, like relevance, like validation. When the Sigma male refuses to play along, they are forced to confront the truth. Their authority is conditional, and their perceived leverage is fragile. The strategies they rely on to feel effective and important suddenly lose meaning. They start to see themselves clearly, stripped of the illusion that they can shape or command another person's choices. This confrontation is subtle but powerful. It isn't a dramatic clash or open challenge. It's a quiet reckoning that happens in the mind. People replay interactions, scrutinize their own motives, and recognize how dependent they are on control to feel safe and competent. The Sigma male doesn't need to do anything. He simply operates according to his own internal standards, unaffected by their attempts to steer him. His calm autonomy makes their obsession with influence look desperate, petty, and unnecessary. The danger of this realization is how destabilizing it can feel. It forces people to question not just their tactics, but their entire approach to relationships, authority, and influence. They see how much energy they've wasted trying to manage outcomes, when the Sigma male never allowed his life to be managed in the first place. That awareness is humbling, uncomfortable, and sometimes infuriating, because it strips away the comforting illusion that control equals power. In the end, trying to remote a Sigma male is less about him and more about the person attempting it. He exposes their dependence on control, their need for predictability, and their inability to accept autonomy in others. That confrontation isn't loud or dramatic, but it's unforgettable. It leaves a mark, forcing people to reckon with a truth they can't ignore. Control over someone self-directed is impossible, and coming to terms with that fact is both terrifying and enlightening. Number 12. Their manipulation techniques stop working without explanation. When people try to remote a Sigma male, one of the first shocks they encounter is that all their usual manipulation techniques suddenly fail, and there's no explanation, no dramatic confrontation, and no visible reason why. Guilt trips, emotional appeals, subtle threats, charm or social pressure that normally get results don't even register. The Sigma male doesn't react because he isn't processing their influence in the way they expect. That failure feels unnerving because it leaves them in a state of confusion. The script they rely on has stopped running, and there's no error message to explain why. Most people are used to predictable reactions. They push, pull, or nudge someone, and behavior follows a recognizable pattern. When those patterns break, it creates a profound sense of instability. The Sigma male doesn't resist in a way that's visible or measurable. He simply operates according to his own internal code. He doesn't engage in conflict, but he doesn't bend either. That lack of response is deeply unsettling because it leaves people grasping for control that doesn't exist. The frustration is magnified because they don't understand what went wrong. Manipulation relies on predictability. Once predictability disappears, their entire approach feels useless. Every tactic they've relied on to get people to act in certain ways suddenly becomes noise. And unlike with most people, where failure triggers negotiation or adjustment, the Sigma male remains unaffected. He doesn't explain himself, justify decisions, or give them an opportunity to regain leverage. This creates a sense of cognitive dissonance. They begin questioning their own abilities, strategies, and even their perception of influence. The Sigma male, by refusing to operate on external cues, forces them to confront the uncomfortable truth. Influence is never guaranteed, and some individuals cannot be programmed to respond according to someone else's design. In the end, the Sigma male's immunity to manipulation isn't about arrogance or defiance. It's about internal sovereignty. He chooses where his attention, emotion, and compliance go, and no external force can override that. That subtle, quiet resistance is terrifying to those who depend on predictability because it exposes their reliance on control and shows, more clearly than any argument, that true autonomy cannot be negotiated. In the end, trying to remote a Sigma male isn't just an exercise in control, it's a journey into the limits of influence, the fragility of assumptions, and the raw truth about human autonomy. Every reaction he triggers, from frustration to obsession, isn't about him failing to comply. It's a reflection of how much people unconsciously rely on directing others to feel secure, relevant, or powerful. The Sigma male doesn't argue, doesn't escalate, and doesn't perform for anyone. He simply operates according to his own internal compass, guided by principles, priorities, and clarity that no external pressure can alter. What makes these interactions so fascinating and sometimes so infuriating is how quietly revealing they are. When someone tries to manipulate, control, or bend him, the mirror he holds shows them the gaps in their own approach to influence. It exposes dependency, entitlement, and the illusion that authority is inherent rather than earned. Every failed attempt to provoke a reaction becomes a lesson in autonomy. Every misunderstanding of his calm independence becomes an opportunity to see how fragile most human systems of control really are. And here's the remarkable truth. The Sigma male doesn't need to assert dominance to be understood. His power lies in what doesn't happen, the silence that breaks illusions, the inaction that unmasks intentions, the stillness that redefines relevance. People walk away feeling disoriented, frustrated, or humbled, often without realizing that the lesson wasn't meant to punish them. It was meant to reveal a deeper reality. Autonomy is magnetic, influence is conditional, and true independence cannot be borrowed, coerced, or engineered. If you found these insights striking, intriguing, or even a little unsettling, don't let the lesson stop here. Hit that subscribe button to stay connected with more content that cuts deeper than the surface. Like the video to show your support, and drop a comment to share your thoughts or experiences with Sigma dynamics. Share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that autonomy is a force to be respected. Every like, comment, and share helps build a community of people who see the world a little clearer and understand the power of someone who cannot be remotely controlled.